Welcome back everyone to Tarantula Exotics, and today we are counting down the top 10 best first spiderlings. That's right, if you're looking for your first spiderling, then I'm going to try and put together a list that I think is based on multiple criteria, and I basically just tried to justify why each of these was on the list and why it fell where it did. And so a few things to go over before we get started. Even on the list itself, I want to talk about the criteria as far as what we're using to break it down and what our evaluation will be based on, as well as defining what a spiderling is. Now, a spiderling is essentially a baby tarantula or baby spider, and to define it even further, I'm going to restrict it to being an inch or less in size. That's how we're going to define a spiderling for this video. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's talk about our criteria for how we're going to be judging these guys. And today we have 5 categories we will be using, and kind of starting from, I guess, least important to most important, let's break it down as far as what our criteria is. Each of the spiders on this list will be rated on a score of 5 for each of these categories. So first up, we have the pricing. Now, I want to clarify this really quickly. Just because something is cheaper doesn't mean it's going to get a higher score. In fact, you'll see soon enough in this video that cheaper can actually hurt the score on pricing, because I think price depends on what you're looking for and how we're going to value these animals. And so pricing is our first criteria. The second criteria we have is the growth rate. Now, this is very important because the slower the growth rate is, I think the more frustrating and more impatient it can make the actual owner. So if this is your first spiderling, the last thing you want is a spider that takes 3 years to start developing color. And so because of that, we are going to be rating these guys on their growth rate. Obviously, the slower they are, the lower they get. Again, this criteria is out of 5 as well. Next up, we have the natural behavior. And all I mean by that is, are they fossorial, meaning they burrow? Are they terrestrial, meaning they're ground dwelling? Or are they arboreal, meaning they live in the trees or prefer to live up high? And that's pretty self-explanatory, but I think the big one to clarify there is fossorial species. And the reason we're going to be going over the fossorial species so much and kind of critiquing them a lot more than others is because the last thing you want, if this is your first spiderling, is a pet hole. So if they're known to burrow and don't come out very often, it's going to get a lower score in that category. Let's talk about number 4 here. Number 4 is the speed and attitude. How fast are they? How aggressive or defensive are they? And what is their feeding response like? If they have a very high feeding response, then that might make up for the rest of the category if they're a little quicker than, say, your average starter spiderling. And so I think you're going to see that come into play a little bit here. We'll get into that. There's a couple maybe semi-controversial picks on here. They are all New World species, but there are 2 that are a little bit quicker than others. But because they score so highly in other categories, I think if that's something you're willing to look past, keep in mind this is the 4th criteria, so I think this is very important. But if you are willing to look past that and you're willing to do the research to look into what makes a spiderling fast and how to kind of work with faster spiderlings, then I think there's going to be no issue with you keeping one of these. Finally, we have our 5th category, and that is resilience. Resilience simply just means how susceptible are they to dying even under sometimes perfect conditions, but also how resilient are they to less than perfect conditions. As this is your first spiderling, I do recommend something that's a little more resilient. And because of that, if you're gonna have fluctuations in temperature, for example, maybe your home is set up so that it gets hot or cold throughout the day and night. Humidity might be an issue for you, so how susceptible are they to low humidity or high humidity, or just a fluctuation of humidity? And I think all that comes into play quite heavily. So resilience is my most important basis on this criteria. And just because of that, we're actually going to go into one of the spiders I think that's frequently recommended that I just don't think has resilience behind it that the entire list here does. And so let's talk about our first and really our only, I'm going to call it a dishonorable mention. I don't mean to be calling anyone out on this or anything like that. Like, this isn't meant to say if you have this on your list, like, you're wrong. You're not. This is just from my experience, and because the criteria I'm judging them on, I think that this particular species, which is the Avicularia, the Carabina versicolor, the Ebropora diversipes, and all those kind of previous Avicularia species, or the pink toe tarantulas, as they're most commonly referred to, from my experience, they just don't have the resilience factor as most of these other ones. They're very receptible to changes in humidity, they're very receptible to changes in temperature, and I've actually kept 4 spiderlings before, all of them under an inch, and not one of them made it to 1.5 inches. I had 3 different issues across the 4 spiderlings, And so I kept Avicularia avicularia, 2 carabinivorous colors, and an Ebropora diversipes. And of those 4, none of them made it past an inch, or 1.5 inches. So 2 of them passed away due to a bad molt. Whether that was a fluctuation in humidity or temperature, I couldn't be specific about it. I don't know. Obviously something I wanted to look out for in the future, so I started tracking that more heavily. One of them also passed away from just dehydration. Now, the weird thing is I offered it both a water dish and I misted it every other day, and it still refused to drink. I don't know what was wrong with the enclosure to stress it out to the level of not drinking, but it's because of that reason again that I just don't recommend them on this beginner list. Finally, we have we had the 4th one who passed away, and it just never ate. Again, it was most likely due to stress because of its environment, but what it was or what caused that stress, I still don't know. I felt like it was the same enclosure, the same environments as most other keepers keep it as, and it just didn't work for me even despite those specific requirements I'd put in place. So going forward, I've decided not to get any more avicularias or carabinas or Ebroporas, at least under the 2-inch mark. If they're a little bigger, they tend to be a little bit more resilient. But again, this list is based on 1 inch or under. So for that reason, I do not recommend avicularias, carabinivorous colors, or Ebropora diversipes, or Ebropora anything, avicularia anything, so on and so forth. Now that we've got that out of the way and we have our criteria in place, we'll be going through this top 10 list based on the rankings off that criteria. So I'll give you the ranking, I'll give you a quick explanation as far as why it ranked where it did in that category, and just kind of go from there. So kicking off our list, we have the number 10 spot. This is the Tolitocotyle albopilosum, formerly the Brachypelma albopilosum, or the curly hair tarantula. And let's start with the pricing aspect of these guys. What did I give it? Now, typically, most of you know you can get these slings for around $5 or $10, usually no more than $10. And because that price point is so cheap, here's where I mentioned before about price being subjective, not just based on low versus high. So with that $5 price mark, my biggest concern is the value of the life of the tarantula. I feel like a $5 price point becomes more of an impulse buy and doesn't reflect the true value of life within that tarantula. So for that reason, I actually gave it a 3 out of 5, because if this is something you are looking for and this is the one you've settled on, then it does have great value. But my concern is there's just too many impulse buys out there for that $5 price point. So 3 out of 5 total score. Next up, we have the growth rate, and this is another one where it just tends to suffer quite a bit. These guys are very slow growers. They're known to be slow growers. If you want a tarantula that you're going to see like the adult colors on, and you want to see it relatively quickly, you know, you're waiting probably 2+ years to see that on these Tolitocotyle species. And so for that reason, I gave the growth rate a 2 out of 5, simply because I don't think the average person buying their first spiderling really wants to wait that long to see those colorations really come out. So 2 out of 5 on growth rate. Next up, we have natural behavior. And I'm looking over here at my sheet. So natural behavior, again, didn't fare too well in. I know they are very much so fossorial, meaning they burrow a lot, and they do grow out of that, don't get me wrong. So once they get to that 3-inch mark, they will grow to that fossorial phase, but the problem is getting to that 3-inch mark, going back to our last criteria, growth rate takes so long that you're really just stuck with a pet hole for a couple years. And that can be boring to someone who's not used to, you know, tarantulas and doesn't have any other ones to look at in the meantime. It can also be very stressful to a new keeper having just a hole in their enclosure and not knowing what's happening. You can't monitor if it's eating very well, you can't monitor how it's progressing, you can't monitor if it's doing well or not doing well. And so for that reason, a 2.5 out of 5 on the growth rate, just simply because it is, in the natural behavior, just simply because it is more so fossorial and it is more of that pet hole type of spider. Next up, of course, we have the speed and attitude, and this is where they excel. This is why they make so many beginner lists, and they're usually in the top 3. A lot of people judge it based on speed and attitude, and it makes total sense. It's, you know, is it going to be a difficult tarantula to work with? And the truth is, they're really not. But going back to our main point here, which is the speed and attitude, these guys are very docile, they're very slow moving, they're very deliberate in their movement, and so for that reason I gave them a 5 out of 5 on the speed and attitude. Last up is resiliency, and again, generally speaking, they are very resilient tarantulas. Where it hurts them is being fossorial, where you can't monitor to see if there is something wrong, and secondly is that slow growth rate. The slow growth rate, trying to get out of that danger zone, which I consider to be under 1 inch, can take over a year. And if you're stuck waiting over a year just to try and get out of that danger zone of risking a bad molt, even if you're doing everything perfectly, it does take away a little bit on the resiliency. That said, I still gave them a 4 out of 5 on resiliency for a total score of 16.5 out of 25, hence the number 10 spot. Coming in at number 9, we actually have the Brachypelma, so very closely related to the Tlittlecoddle, which is why they're so close in this list. You're going to see a lot of the same issues I have with the Tlittlecoddle with the Brachypelma. Now with Brachypelma, I am particularly focusing on the genus as a whole, not just one species, but generally speaking, we can argue that we can include the Oratum, the Bamie, the Amelia, the Classy, the Homori, etc., in this list, because they're all around the same price point and they all have similar care requirements. So the price on Brachypelma is coming in at that $25 mark for captive bred specimens, which really means we're leaving the wild ones where they belong. And so by having and supporting a captive bred hobby, that did increase the overall price rating I gave it. So I gave it a 4 out of 5 on the pricing because I think at $25 it's very good value. And because you're supporting captive bred and not wild caught, that also adds the pricing as well. Next up, of course, is the growth rate on these guys, and the growth rate, just like the Tlittlecoddles, because they are semi-related, unfortunately gets a 2 out of 5. They are very slow growers, and again, you're looking at waiting 2 to 3 years before you start seeing that beautiful coloration come in. Now, don't get me wrong, these slow growers might seem like a bad choice, but I can tell you this right now, there is nothing more satisfying than spending 5, 6, 7 years waiting for this thing to grow into an adulthood and seeing the payoff. You know, taking that very small 1/4 inch sling and having it get up to that 5, 6 inch mark is one of the best accomplishments anyone can really ask for. And I think it's got so much reward, but this is your first spiderling, you know, you want to see those colors early on. You don't want to be waiting 2 or 3 years to see them. And so for that reason, unfortunately, despite the reward, just like the Tlittlecoddle, it gets a 2 out of 5. The natural behavior on these guys, from my experience, is actually somewhat surprising. The Tlittlecoddle is primarily a fossorial species, yet the Brachypelmas all tend to be out a lot more. Now they do tend to have burrows and tend to burrow down a little bit, but the split is kind of like a 60-40, 70-30 split. 60% of the time it's out and about, and about 40% of the time it's in its burrow, which is a very well balanced tarantula. You're not stuck with just a pet hole. You are going to see this thing on a fairly semi-regular occasion. So that helped it a little bit. So for the natural behavior, they get a 3.5 out of 5. Next up, we have the speed and the attitude here. And again, just like the Tlittlecoddles, these guys are generally speaking very, very calm, very docile, and not overly defensive. I do think they can go through stages where they don't eat, which gives the feeding response a bit of a hit on this one. And so for that reason, I gave it a 4 out of 5 instead of the 5 out of 5. But it's very close and it's very arguable where it really sits, because some of them eat very well, but on average, most of them don't. Next, of course, resiliency. Again, for that same reason, we gave it a 4 out of 5. And I just want to stress that, you know, these slow growers tend to be a little bit more stressful to really help you, or to really get yourself involved with these animals. And because they're slow growers, I always worry that because they stay smaller for so much longer, there is more risk when they molt, and for that reason I can't give them a perfect 5, I have to give them a 4 out of 5. So the Brachypelma genus, generally speaking, comes in at a score of 17.5 out of 25. Coming in at number 8, we actually have basically the final portion of this trifecta, the Tlittlecoddles, the Brachypelmas, and of course, number 8, the Grammostolas. Now here I'm pretty much particularly talking about the Pulchras and the Pulchripes, or the Brazilian Blacks and the Chaco Goldenese. And the reason we're talking about those ones in particular, yes, there's the Roseas and the Porteries and the Ihorringis, which are all great as well and kind of fall in that same category. But I wanted to choose these two in particular because these are two I have more than my fair share of experience with. And so based on those two, that's what I've kind of given these results on. So kicking this off with price, you do have a pretty big fluctuation. The Pulchripes tend to retail for about $25 to $30, and the Pulchras upwards of $60 to $70. Now this is in Canadian currency from what I'm using, but just keep that in mind, you know, make the conversion rates where you need to. But because of that price range, they don't score super high on price because it is a bit of a fluctuation, but I gave them a price score of a 3 out of 5. Next up is growth, and again, these are slow growers, and for the same reason as the brachypelmas and the little caudals, they're a 2 out of 5. I don't really need to say much more on that. 2 out of 5 for the growth rate. Natural behavior, I find they're more like brachypelmas than they are like the little caudals. They tend to be out a lot more, and so the split there is about a 60-40 again. 60% of the time they're out of their burrow, and 40% of the time they're in their burrow. I actually have a Grammostola pulchra, and it has never burrowed at all. In fact, I actually gave it 2 man-made burrows to choose from, and it has not chosen either one. It prefers to stay out on top of its enclosure. And, you know, I gave it a 3.5, which is the same as I gave the brachypelma, but arguably I probably could have bumped that up to maybe even a 4 because my pulchra is out a lot more, but my pulchra did burrow a lot more. So it was a balance act right there. So 3.5 out of 5. The speed and attitude, mine were both amazing eaters. They both had great feeding responses. If we're looping the roseas and the porterias in here, I might have docked it a bit, but because we're not, we're focusing on the pulchras and the pulchripes, I gave their overall speed and attitude a perfect 5 out of 5. They're generally speaking, they're very docile, they're very curious, which I think is super cute. I think most people will find that as well. And of course, they eat great, but they're not gonna go out running across the enclosure and get out on you. It's very easy to track them, you're not gonna lose sight of them. And for that reason, because they tend to be very slow moving, generally speaking, they got the perfect 5 out of 5 on that one. Last up, of course, is the resiliency, and for the same reason as the brachypelmas and its little caudals, it gets a 4 out of 5. Despite its feeding response, because it's such a slow grower, again, it stays in that vulnerable state of that under 1 inch mark for just so much longer, and there's so much more risk in that. So 4 out of 5. Chances are you'll be okay if you take the proper procedures in setting up the enclosure. But even in some cases, you can do everything perfectly right, and those slow-growing tarantulas just find a way to have a bad molt and just have everything go wrong. So total score on the Grammostolas was actually tied with the brachypelmas at a 17.5 out of 25. They edged up to the number 8 spot just because I weighed the speed and attitude and feeding response higher on the list, which is where they scored higher. They got a 5 out of 5, whereas the brachypelmas only got a 4 out of 5. Next up, we have number 7, and here we have reached the controversial pick. This is not in a lot of beginner species lists that I've seen. In fact, I've only seen them appear in one list, and even when they appeared in that list, they were kind of mentioned as it's beginner spider, but you should have a lot more experience for yet this. And that was actually from the Dark Den of all places, and I thought it was a good pick actually. And I didn't think he had to justify it as much as what he did, but I do think there is some justification required. So let's talk about this. This is the Samopos erminia. And before we get into any of the ratings, you're going to see that it has very high ratings across the board, except for in one pretty important category. And I think the kind of prelude to this one is that if you are going to get a Samopos erminia, just make sure that you have ample research done on how to rehouse and how to, I'm going to use the word handle, but I don't mean handle. Please, this is your first spiderling, do not handle this one. It's very fast. But what I mean is like work with. And so once you've done the research on how to work with them and how to rehouse them, then the rest just becomes easy. And if you do proper rehousing videos, if you watch proper rehousing videos, it's not gonna be that difficult to keep these guys. And so that's my defense for putting them at number 7. Let's talk about the rest of the categories. Price. I actually gave them a 4 out of 5. These guys retail for that perfect $20 sweet spot, and the payoff for the price for the color is very high. I mean, this is a black and orange tarantula, and it has color early on in its life, which means you're not gonna have to wait 2 or 2.5 years to see the color. It basically comes with the color. At that half-inch mark, it has pretty cool colorings. The black and oranges do start to appear at that stage, and you're not stuck waiting too long to kind of get that like you would with some of the other species. So price, $20 for an already pretty colorful tarantula, very cool, 4 out of 5. The growth rate, these guys are medium to fast growing, so again, a 4 out of 5 for that reason. You're not gonna be stuck waiting forever to try and see this thing grow. You're gonna get to experience it in a very reasonable amount of time. Every couple months you're gonna see it molt, and of course, depending on the size, that will vary. But generally speaking, every couple months you can see it molt. It'll start getting brighter and brighter colors. The payoff is there, so 4 to 5 on the growth rate. Natural behavior, this is an arboreal tarantula. Yes, they can be semi-fossorial, meaning they can sometimes burrow, but generally speaking, they prefer to be up in the trees and up on cork bark. And if you give it a cork bark round and you give it a place to hide, it often won't burrow. It'll just kind of chill inside that cork bark round where it feels safe and secure, because that's all it really wants to do. It's not burrowing to resent you or anything like that. It's just trying to get away so it can hide when it needs its own space. And so for that reason, I gave it a 4 out of 5 on natural behavior, because it is mostly arboreal. Next up is unfortunately that big downfall we talked about earlier, and that is the speed and attitude. This is where it really gets hurt on points. I gave it a 2 out of 5 for that, and I'm just going to talk about it really quickly for why I still think it could be appropriate despite its very fast nature. In fact, it is the fastest tarantula on this list, but I don't think it's unmanageable. I think the speed is manageable. It's not, you know, going to bolt off where you can't see it and you blink and it's gone. Some people will say they do, but I feel like it's very easy to track them, and they're not that difficult as far as learning the proper rehousing steps to ensure that bolts are kept to a minimum and that you don't have to stress when you are rehousing or when you are, you know, working with this tarantula. So their feeding response did make up for it a little bit. They have great feeding response, and that did help it a bit, but the speed did cut it back a significant amount. So for speed and attitude, I gave it a 2 out of 5 just for that reason. Last of course is the resiliency, and this is again where they score very high with a 4 out of 5. Really the only downside to them, they are very adjustable to temperature changes and to humidity changes, but where they lose points is because of that speed. If you don't take the time to properly learn how to rehouse these guys, my concern is you might end up losing them because you're just not paying attention, you're not giving them the respect they deserve due to their speed. Now most people, I think you'll be able to handle this, and I'm not saying that you can't. I'm just saying that it is something to consider when making the scoring points up for the resiliency. So a 4 out of 5 is what I really ended up deciding was a fair mark for the Somnopulus erminia. The total score on the Somnopulus erminia, an 18 out of 25, which I think is very respectable. Next up, we actually have the Aphonopelma genus. And again, we're focusing really on 3 here. We're going to discard some of the very high-end Aphonopelmas because that will fluctuate the scoring system on this a little bit too much. So the 3 we're focusing on here is the Hensi, Bioideus, and the Chalcodes, or the Arizona Blonde, the Texas Tan, Texas Brown, among other things. And so what I like about these guys is the price point comes in at that really nice $20 to $30 mark, which I think is more than fair. It reflects the value of their life, but also doesn't, you know, feel like an overcharge for what you're getting. I think $20 to $30 for your first Spiderling is kind of where you want to expect to pay, depending on what your plans are, of course, and depending on which Spiderling you decide to choose. So price point, they do get a 4 to 5 for that reason. Next up, we have the growth rate, and again, unfortunately, these guys are slow growers, just like the Brachypelmas, just like the Tilicoddles, just like the Grammostolas, but in my experience, they do grow slightly faster. So I gave them a slight edge on the price, or on the growth rate, and gave them a 3 out of 5 rather than a 2 out of 5 like the previously mentioned. Natural behavior, again, I consider them a lot like the Brachypelmas and the Grammostolas. While they do burrow quite a bit, they tend to be out more often than not. So again, that 60-40 split of 60% of the time they are out and about, and 40% of the time they're in their burrows. It's just something to consider. You know, they are going to burrow, but they're not going to feel like that true pet hole like maybe the Tilicoddle might. And so for that reason, I give them the exact same score as the Brachypelmas and the Grammostolas at 3.5. Speed and attitude, of course, we're talking about a very laid back, chilled out tarantula. It's not very defensive, but it has a great feeding response at the same time, which is that perfect combination. And then of course the speed on these guys, they're typically fairly slow moving. They move very deliberately. They don't just run off in any direction. And I think that's a big plus for these guys, just like the Brachypelmas and the Grammostolas. They actually get a 4 out of 5 on the speed and attitude for that reason. Last, of course, resilience on these guys, and again, these are one that are very resilient to changes in their environment, changes in the temperature, changes in the humidity. They live in North America after all, which has some pretty harsh conditions sometimes. Even in the south of North America, you can still see some snow sometimes, and that builds up quite a bit of resiliency. So for that reason, they get a 4 out of 5. Again, they lost a mark just because they are a slow-growing tarantula, and always in that under 1 inch mark. It is tough that you could be doing everything right, and unfortunately could still pass due to a bad mold. So there is always risk there, so 4 out of 5 for that reason. Total score on the Aphonopelmas, by the way, is a 18.5, which I think is very respectable given what you're getting for that spider. Coming in at number 5, we actually have one I've never owned before. I'm kind of taking a lot of keepers' words on this one, which is why I included it on the list. Maybe I shouldn't have, maybe I should have. I'm not sure. I'll let you guys decide what the But the verdict on that, if you agree with this placement or if it deserves to be higher up or lower on the list, and that is the Eupalastris campistratus, which is basically like a dwarf Chilean rose. I actually don't know the common name, but they tend to get bigger than most dwarf tarantulas, so in that 3.5 to 4 inch range. And price-wise right now, they're available for about $40 for a 1/4 inch sling. I think around that $50 mark for a 1/2 inch sling. So price, now we're going the other way, you know, some of them are too cheap. This I think is a little more expensive, but they are very hard to find sometimes, and because of that, I can see the price being somewhat justified. So for pricing on these guys, I gave them a 3 out of 5 for that reason. Next, of course, the growth rate. These guys are, you know, slow to medium growers from my understanding. Again, I haven't worked with them. If you think this evaluation should change, let me know. But for growth rate, I gave them a 3 out of 5 because I feel like they're about on par with the Aphonopelmas and a little faster than those Grammostolas and the Brachypelmas for growth. Natural behavior. This is actually a big one. From my understanding, they almost never burrow. They're always out and they don't move around a lot, which is kind of that perfect terrestrial you're looking for that first spiderling. And so for that reason, I actually gave them a 4 out of 5 on natural behavior. Maybe they deserve a 5 out of 5. Maybe it should be lower. Maybe I'm wrong on some of that. I'm just going off what other people have said. So this was a very tough one to judge. And again, let me know your thoughts in the comments below on what you'd rate all these categories for the Eupalastris campistratus. Speed and attitude, we go back to that pet rock mentality. I like it. I've heard they're very good eaters. They're very relaxed and laid back. They don't tend to be very defensive and they don't tend to be very fast either. They just kind of sit there. And for that reason, for a first spiderling, it gets a 5 out of 5 on the speed and attitude. Last, of course, resiliency. Resiliency, you know, self-explanatory. 4 out of 5, still somewhat of a slow grower, and because it's a dwarf species, I gave it a 4 out of 5. Maybe I should give it higher, maybe I should give it lower. I'll let you guys decide in the comments below where this one should actually rank. This was more of a filler spot. I wanted to put some other stuff in here, but I couldn't make this list without including them because they are so highly recommended. So number 5, I felt like that was a safe spot right in the middle. Coming to number 4, we have the Nandu tripepi. Now, Nandu colorado villosus, Nandu chromatus could have also been in this spot. It's kind of interchangeable. They're all about the same rating, give or take. But I chose tripepi because I actually have one, and that way I could show footage of it, but take your pick. I do have a colorado villosus, but it is a larger one. It's a juvenile, so it was tough to really put it in there because I didn't actually raise it. I bought it as a juvenile, whereas the tripepi I'm actually raising right now is a spiderling, and so it just fit the mark. But enough rambling, let's talk about its ratings. With the price point, it comes in at a 4 to 5, typically around that $20 to $25 mark. Again, that sweet spot for your first spiderling, in my opinion. Now, of course, based on your income, based on what you have available, that might be too low, too high. I just felt like that $20 mark really justifies, you know, the value of its life without going too cheap or too expensive for what you're getting. So 3 to 5 or 4 to 5 on the pricing. For the growth rate, again, these guys are a little slower. They are kind of slow to medium growth rate, so I gave them a 3 out of 5. I'm looking at this now. I think I maybe should have been a little more generous, maybe a 3.5 out of 5, because they're a little bit faster than the Aphonopelmas and definitely faster than the Brachypelmas and the Grammostolas. But I give it a 3 out of 5. Maybe it should be a 3.5, but I'll let you guys decide that in the comments below. The natural behavior, again, these guys, from my experience with the one I'm raising right now, it never burrows, but it does have a hide available, so it will go in the hide when it does feel threatened or it gets a little scared. So for that reason, because it's not really much of a burrower, I gave it a 3.5 out of 5. And again, I'm seeing that number now, and I'm thinking maybe it could have been a little bit higher because generally they are pretty good. But I know they can be burrowers, so I kind of went a little bit safe on that 3.5 mark. Mine isn't, but yours might be, so just keep that in mind. The speed and attitude of these guys, they are a little bit more flighty and a little bit more bolty, but they don't go that fast. They're not unmanageable. And so for that reason, I actually give them a 4 to 5 on speed and attitude because even though they are a little bit bolty, they are great eaters and they're not very defensive. They tend to choose flight over fight every time. So 4 to 5 on the attitude and speed. Finally, the resiliency, again, this is one where it gets the 5 out of 5. And the reason it gets 5 out of 5 is because it isn't a slow grower. It will get in that safe zone much faster than some of the other ones on this list. And generally speaking, they eat very, very well. They molt very, very well, and they are very resilient to temperature changes and climate changes, and humidity changes. So for that reason, 5 out of 5 on resiliency. And I believe That is in fact our first 5 out of 5 on resiliency, and it came at the number 4 spot with the Nandutri. Before we get into our top 3 list, I do want to make a quick honorable mention here, and that is the genus Acanthoscurria, specifically Acanthoscurria geniculata. I think is a great beginner spider, especially as a spiderling. I decided not to include on this list because I think it would have actually bumped off some of the more popular recommendations, like the Tolitocotyle albopilosum, which I wanted to speak on, even though it may not entirely deserve to be in the top 10, in my opinion. I wanted to speak on it more than the Acanthoscurria for that reason, but the Acanthoscurria I think actually scores very well. And the reason I made the honorable mention just before the top 3 is because I think the Acanthoscurria would score on par with the Nandutri. I think they're about interchangeable at that number 4 spot. Now that we've got that done and we're down to the top 3, this is where we gotta get serious. This is where I think the best beginner spiderlings really are in this top 3 list. The separation between third place and first place is 1.5 points. That is how close it came down to. Kicking things off at number 3, we have the ever popular and always recommended Lasiodora parahybana. I've also included the Lasiodora striatopes on here, which actually balanced out a little bit. And really that comes into the price point. The striatopes is around the $25 to $30 range, but the parahybana is in that really frustrating $5 range, maybe $10. And I have so much trouble with that range because, again, going back to that little coddle statement, my concern is they're often being bought as impulse buys. They're often bought as 1/4-inch slings, and unlike the little coddle, these guys get big. You're talking 7+ inches as adults, and when you buy something that's that big and it gets that big, you may not have bought you may not have bargained for what you expected. And I think that's a big misleading factor, is that $5 price mark on something that does grow that big. So price point on those, 3 out of 5, very similar to the little coddle. I had to knock it because it's too cheap. And maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. If you're looking for one and you're prepared for that, then $5 is a great deal. I think it's good value, but it might be too good value. So 3 out of 5 on price point. Next up, of course, we have the growth rate, and this is our first and actually our only 5 out of 5. Growth rate gets a 5 out of 5. These are a fast growing species. You're gonna very much enjoy seeing this guy change very rapidly from a 1/4-inch or a 1/2-inch spiderling to a 2-inch spiderling or more, or a 2-inch juvenile in the first year alone. So you're gonna see a lot of growth here. You're gonna see a lot of colorations come out, and it doesn't take that long for the rewards to pay off. So 5 out of 5 on the growth rate. Natural behavior, these guys are primarily terrestrial. Mine has a small hide, which it will retreat into when it gets frightened. But again, much like the Nandutri, it's often seen roaming around, and it's not overly shy, but it's not defensive or anything either, which we'll get to in just a second. So natural behavior gets a 4 to 5 because they can sometimes burrow. Speed and attitude, of course, I just kind of touched on a little bit. Speed and attitude, I gave it a 4 to 5. And again, going back to it, they can be a little bit bolty, but they're not so fast that I'm concerned about recommending them. They're just a little quicker than some of the other ones on this list, like the Brachypelmas or the Grammostolas. So 4 to 5 on the speed and attitude. And also, of course, they are great eaters, so that helps as well. Resiliency, we have another 5 out of 5 here. Again, these guys are resilient to temperature changes, humidity changes, changes in their diet even. Like, these guys are kind of the epitome of that very resilient, hardy spiderling. So 5 out of 5 on that for a total score of 21 out of 25. Now keep in mind, that's our 3rd place winner. Coming in 2nd place, not quite getting that 1st place mark, is the green bottle blue or the Chromatopelma cyanopubescens. The reason why I came in at 2nd, I mean, it's amazing because this is one that was actually justified. A lot of people have it very high in their list, and now we've justified it with this kind of arbitrary but not rating system I've put in place. So let's go over the ratings and see where it lost some points. Pricing, I gave it a 3.5. Now they are a little bit more expensive at the $50 mark, but the value for the coloration you get to see right out of the box, at that 1/4-inch, 1/2-inch sling mark, I think is actually much higher than a 3.5. But I know for some people, $50 is quite a bit for a spiderling, and especially being your first spiderling, that might be a little out of your price point, especially if you're just trying to, embrace the community and just try it out for yourself. Maybe it's a little more expensive than what you're willing to spend. I think there's value. I think a lot of people would agree with me there's value there. But because of that reason, I gave it a 3.5 rather than like a 4.5, which I think is maybe even closer to what it might even deserve. But value is of course up to you guys, and price is somewhat subjective in this list, which is why it's the first criteria and not the most important. Next up we have the growth rate. These guys are medium growth growers, and what's more impressive about the growth rate is the color change they go through. That really helps them out a lot. So for the growth rate, despite them not being as fast as the Lazadora Parahybanas, which we just mentioned, I still give them a 4 to 5 because I think you're going to enjoy every time they grow. And because of that, and because they, even though they don't grow quite as fast, you're still rewarded in other ways. Next up, of course, we have the natural behaviors, and this is where they really shine. So natural behaviors, I give them a perfect 5. And in fact, other than the number 1 spot, it is the only perfect 5 on the list for natural behaviors. Now this is of course based on personal preference, but if you're looking for a spider that's going to web up everything in its cage, this is your guy. This is the one you're going to want to go with because they are prolific webbers. And I think that makes a huge difference. They're terrestrial, they don't often burrow, and because of that, if they have ample space and ample anchor points, which obviously you want to decorate your enclosure for these guys, to give them that ample anchor points, they will web everything up and it's going to look so cool. So a 5 out of 5 on natural behaviors. Next, of course, is the speed and attitude. Speed and attitude, they got a 4 out of 5. They can be a little bit shy and skittish, but generally speaking, they're just curious. And I think that's really cool. But because there is a risk of having, you know, one that's maybe a little bit more nervous, I give it a 4 out of 5 just in case. Again, arguably it could have been a little bit higher, but 4 out of 5 was a safe bet in my opinion across the board. Last of course, we have the resiliency. Resiliency, again, these guys are very good with different humidity changes, different temperature changes. They eat like there's no tomorrow, so you never have to be stressed about not eating. And for that reason, and because of their medium growth rate, they get a perfect 5 out of 5, just like the last two on our list. So 5 out of 5 for a total score of 21.5. They just edged out the Lazadora Parahybana by 0.5. Again, maybe it should have been a little bit more of a defeat, or maybe the screen should have been the Lazadora Parahybana coming ahead. It all depends on what you put preference on, if it's price or if it's certain other criteria that you think might be better off. So 21.5 out of 25 for the green bottle blue or the Chromatopelma cyanopubescens. This now brings us to our number 1 spot, and this is really the reason I made this list. This number 1 spot is a tarantula that is on almost no list that I've actually seen for beginner species. And I can't figure out why. I think it just gets missed, and maybe it has, you know, this unfair perception, but I think they make one of the best spiderlings in general, whether it's your first or your 20th or your 50th. I love these guys. I'm obsessed with them. The only other person I know on YouTube who thinks this highly of them, although I don't even think he put them in his beginner lists, is Tom Moran. And that should give away what I'm talking about. If you watch a lot of YouTube videos and lots of tarantula videos, then you know I'm referring to the one, the only Phormictopus. I've specifically put the Phormictopus cancerides on this list. I do have some other Phormictopus species coming in the next month, but until I get them, I don't feel comfortable giving them the exact same rating as the cancerides. I've actually had 3 cancerides in the past 7 or 8 years now, and all of them have done very well in my care. I did sell one off maybe 4 or 5 years ago, but since then I've got 2 more, and I love these guys. So let's talk about their overall ratings. Price point, they got a 4 out of 5. They're in that $20 to $30 price range, which I love. These guys are so fun to keep, and I think $20 to $30 for what you're getting. We talked about the green bottle blue getting a slightly higher price point, but also having a much higher reward because it has this great color when you first get it. Just like the green bottle blue, the Phormictopus cancerides starts out as this gorgeous blue color that does change over time. And for $20 to $30 for this gorgeous blue tarantula, this little blue gem, I love that price point, and that's why they got a 4 out of 5 on that. Now, of course, none of these actually got a 5 out of 5 in price point because it was such a subjective category. I couldn't justify giving anything a 5 out of 5, but this one probably came the closest. Between this one and the green bottle blue, I think there's value at both points, but the $20 to $30 mark for a gorgeous blue tarantula, 4 out of 5 for that reason. Next, of course, we have the growth rate, and this is where another very unique aspect comes into play. We've talked about like consistently fast-growing tarantulas, consistently medium-growing tarantulas, slow-growing tarantulas. What we haven't experienced yet is a fast-growing tarantula at first that tends to slow down over time. And that's what I love about the Phormictopus. It'll reach that 2-inch mark in the first year. It's going to start its color change shortly after that. And yet, once it gets, 2 years old or so, I've noticed they tend to slow down their growth significantly, which means you get to enjoy the color transformation for longer. And so it goes from like a fast growing to like a medium growing species in the matter of over its lifespan and in the right stages. I love that it starts out fast growing so you can get out of that potentially risky, half-inch mark quick enough, but then enjoy it in its juvenile stage for a longer amount of time. So for that reason, I gave it a 4.5 out of 5, only because I wasn't sure if people would appreciate that as much as I do. So I knocked it half a point, because if you want just a straight fast growing, get as big as it can right away, then you're gonna want to go with the Lasiodora parahybana. But if you want to appreciate that like I do, I think it should have got a 5 out of 5, but I docked it half a point because I wasn't sure what you guys thought. I wanted to be as fair as I could on here. Next up, of course, the natural behaviors. Both of mine are straight terrestrials. Now my bigger one did start to burrow more recently, but it never uses it. It's so weird. It dug this burrow and then never goes in there. It'll go in there if it needs to retreat, so if it feels threatened, it will retreat there, but within 10 minutes it's right back out. And I love that. My small one has yet to even consider making a burrow. It just stays out nonstop under this little tiny fake plant I have in there. It chills under there like it's chilling in the shade, and I love that behavior so much. So because of that, and the fact that I think they are great terrestrial species, I give them a 5 out of 5 for natural behavior. I know they're not prolific webbers. They do web quite a bit, not as much as the green bottle blues, but I still have to give it a 5 out of 5 because if you're looking for high webbers, you go with the green bottle blue. If you're looking for high visibility, you go with the Phormictopus. And I had to reward it for that. So 5 out of 5 on the natural behavior. Speed and attitude. This is one where I think they lose some marks, but not justifiably. So I give it a 4 out of 5, and I don't find that they're that skittish. I don't find that they're that fast. They tend to move very deliberately. Are they going to be as slow as like a Brachypelma? No. But are they manageable? Absolutely. They are very well manageable, and they're not going to run off on you. So 4 out of 5 for that reason. I docked it 1 mark because they're maybe a little skittish, but they're not shy and they're not defensive. And they are fantastic eaters. By far the best eaters on this list, maybe even the best New World tarantula eaters, period. It's tough to say, but I think they deserve higher than that, but I had to hold back because they are my favorite tarantula. I didn't want to seem biased. 4 out of 5, which I think is maybe even being too harsh on them. Last, of course, is resiliency, and we go right back to that 5 out of 5. These guys are great. They always eat. I mean, they can be in pre-molt and still take down a meal. There is no concern about them not eating. They have that really fast growth rate when they're smaller, that they kind of slow down when they get bigger. Perfect combination. And because they grow so fast when they're younger, they're less susceptible to those, long molts that some of the Brachypelmas and the Grammostolas might be susceptible to. So again, 5 out of 5 on resiliency for a total score of our first place champion, 22.5 out of 25. And I think I was being a little harsh on them. I think they should have scored higher, but I do have a bias here, so I wanted to eliminate that bias as much as possible. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are. What do you think about putting the Phormictopus cancerides on this list? If you're an experienced keeper, I'd love to hear from you guys. If this is something you're watching for your first video, or you're first trying to get into spiderlings and you really want to see an opinion here, I want to know what you think. Was this helpful? Was it not helpful? I know I didn't use a lot of common names. I probably could have, but I don't know them all, to be honest. I'll try and put common names over top of like the scientific names when I show them, just so you guys can see what it is. But I do prefer using scientific names, and it's for that reason that I decided to stick with the scientific names. I'm curious to know what your list would look like. I'm curious to know what you think of this list. Do you agree? Is there anything you would move around? Love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I had a lot of fun making this video, and I can't wait to do more top 10 lists for you guys. If you guys do enjoy these, make sure to let me know by leaving a like on the video. And if you have any ideas for another top 10 list, I'd love to hear your suggestions in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.